At a lavish party, a millionaire mocks his black Maid's dreams of success, only to be moved to tears, along with the entire audience, when she performs and reveals her true talent. And if you cherish your family and love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and avoid 10 years of bad luck. The Thompson Mansion stood as a testament to wealth and privilege, its marble columns and crystal chandeliers gleaming under the evening lights. Security guards stationed at regular intervals ensured only invited guests passed through the ornate iron gates. Luxury vehicles lined the circular driveway, their drivers carefully maneuvering between Bentleys and Rolls-Royces. Inside, Charles Thompson commanded attention in the grand ballroom. His tailored Armani suit and perfectly coiffed silver hair marked him as someone accustomed to the finest things in life. He held court near the center of the room, surrounded by a circle of equally well-dressed guests who hung on his every word. "Success isn't about luck," Charles declared, swirling his glass of 30-year-old scotch. "It's about knowing your place in the world and maximizing your natural advantages." His audience nodded in agreement, their jewelry catching the light. Some people waste their lives chasing impossible dreams instead of accepting reality. The laughter that followed his statement carried through the open doors into the kitchen, where Lisa Carter worked efficiently, restocking serving trays and directing the catering staff. The kitchen's stainless steel surfaces reflected the harsh fluorescent lighting, creating a stark contrast to the warm glow of the ballroom beyond. Lisa paused briefly, her hands resting on a silver tray of hors d'oeuvres. Through the service entrance, she could see the guests in their designer clothes, drinking champagne that cost more than her monthly rent. The scene reminded her of her grandmother's words, spoken in their small apartment over countless Sunday dinners. "Baby girl, don't you ever let anyone tell you where your ceiling is. The only limits that exist are the ones you accept." Her grandmother had worked as a housekeeper for 40 years, saving every extra penny to buy Lisa her first piano. Even now, Lisa could picture the old upright in their living room, its keys slightly yellowed but the sound still pure and true. She'd practiced on that piano every night after finishing her homework, developing her voice while her grandmother hummed along from a rocking chair. The memory faded as Charles's voice grew louder, carrying clearly into the kitchen. He'd moved closer to the service entrance with his entourage, still holding forth on his philosophy of life. "Take my staff, for example," he said, gesturing broadly. "My housekeeper seems to think she's going to be some sort of singer." He laughed, and several guests joined in. "I mean, really, know your place. That's what I always say. Some people are meant to serve, and others are meant to be served. That's just the natural order of things." Lisa's hands tightened on the serving tray, her knuckles whitening. She stood perfectly still, invisible to Charles and his guests despite being mere feet away. The weight of his words pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than any tray she'd ever carried. The kitchen staff around her continued their work, heads down, pretending they hadn't heard, a skill learned through years of service in wealthy homes. The cut crystal glasses on her tray clinked softly as she steadied her hands. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind again. "Let them underestimate you, baby. Their blindness is your opportunity." Lisa straightened her back and lifted her chin, even as Charles's laughter continued to echo through the kitchen. She had survived worse than his casual cruelty, and she would survive this too. But something had shifted in the air of that kitchen, something electric and unstable. The natural order Charles spoke of so confidently was about to face a challenge he never saw coming. Lisa's fingers brushed against the folded sheet music in her apron pocket, her own compositions, written in stolen moments between shifts. Perhaps it was time to show Charles Thompson exactly what someone like her could do. The service corridor leading to the kitchen's back area provided Lisa's only refuge from the party's constant demands. She stood before a long utility mirror, originally installed so servers could check their appearance before returning to the floor. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across her face, highlighting the tension in her jaw and the weariness in her eyes. "You are enough," she whispered to her reflection, but Charles's words had lodged themselves deep in her mind like splinters. Her hands, capable of coaxing beautiful melodies from piano keys, now felt heavy and uncertain. The pristine white uniform she wore, selected by Charles's wife to make the staff appropriately invisible, suddenly felt like a costume in someone else's play. The kitchen door swung open, breaking her moment of reflection. Marcus Green, one of the most influential music producers in the industry, stumbled in. His bow tie hung loose around his neck, and he carried an empty whiskey glass. He paused, seeming surprised to find someone in this back area of the kitchen. "Sorry," he said, his voice carrying none of the artificial polish she'd heard from the other guests. "Just looking for a refill," without fighting through the crowd. He gestured vaguely toward the main party area, where Charles's booming laughter could still be heard. Lisa straightened immediately, professional training taking over. "Of course, sir. What were you drinking? I can get that for you right away." She moved toward the service bar, but Marcus waved her off. "I can manage," he said, studying her face with unexpected intensity. "You okay? You look like someone just stole your dream and kicked your dog for good measure." His directness caught her off guard, breaking through her carefully maintained professional facade. Lisa hesitated, weighing her response. Years of service had taught her the danger of honesty with employers or their guests. But something in Marcus's expression, a genuine concern she rarely saw from the mansion's visitors, made her pause. "I'm fine," she started then stopped. The weight of Charles's dismissive words, the years of suppressed ambition, and the constant pressure to remain invisible suddenly felt unbearable. "Actually, no, I'm not okay. I'm tired of being told what I can't do by people who've never had to fight for anything in their lives." Marcus set his glass down on the steel counter, giving her his full attention. "And what is it you want to do?" The question hung in the air between them, simple but loaded with possibility. Lisa's hand unconsciously moved to her apron pocket, where her sheet music lay folded. The paper seemed to burn against her skin, demanding acknowledgement. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Your voice is a gift, baby. Don't let anyone silence it." "I write music," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I sing. I've been studying and practicing for years, working double shifts to pay for lessons." The words tumbled out, gaining strength as they went. "But apparently, people like me should know their place." Marcus's expression hardened slightly at her last words. "People like you," he repeated, his tone careful but pointed. "You mean talented people? Dedicated people? Because that's what I'm hearing." He leaned against the counter, creating a casual atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the kitchen's rigid formality. "You know, every major artist I've ever worked with had someone tell them to quit. Someone who thought they knew better. Someone who had the power to crush dreams." He picked up his glass again, turning it thoughtfully in his hands. "The ones who made it? They weren't necessarily the most talented. They were the ones who refused to listen." The possibility of performing, of being heard, flickered in Lisa's mind like a dangerous flame. She thought of the party guests just beyond the kitchen doors, of Charles and his judgments, of the sheet music in her pocket that no one had ever heard. "I wouldn't even know where to begin," she said, but her tone had changed. The defeat from earlier was gone, replaced by something closer to calculation. The mirror behind her reflected a different woman now, one standing straighter, with a spark of determination in her eyes. Marcus smiled, recognizing the shift in her demeanor. "Sometimes," he said, "the hardest part is just opening your mouth and letting the first note out. Everything after that is just persistence." He paused, then added carefully, "And sometimes the best place to begin is exactly where they least expect you to." The party's energy had shifted into that dangerous territory between sophistication and excess. Crystal glasses clinked more frequently, laughter grew louder, and the careful masks of propriety began to slip. Charles Thompson remained at the center of it all, his face flushed with expensive wine and self-satisfaction as he regaled yet another group with tales of his business triumphs. Lisa moved through the crowd like a ghost, collecting empty glasses and dodging errant gestures from increasingly animated guests. Each round through the ballroom felt like navigating a minefield of potential humiliation. The sounds of celebration, the clinking glasses, the burst of laughter, the murmur of self-congratulatory conversations seemed to mock her presence. During a brief respite in the kitchen, her phone vibrated. Her grandmother's name appeared on the screen, a lighthouse in the storm. Lisa slipped into the pantry, closing the door behind her for privacy. "Grandma?" Her whisper echoed slightly in the confined space. "I had a feeling you might need to hear a friendly voice tonight, baby." Her grandmother's warm tone wrapped around her like a familiar blanket. "How's that fancy party going?" Lisa's throat tightened. "They don't see me, Grandma. Or worse, they see right through me. Mr. Thompson." She paused, steadying her voice. "He made it very clear what he thinks about my dreams." Her grandmother hummed, and Lisa could picture her sitting in her worn armchair, phone pressed to her ear. "And since when does Charles Thompson get to decide what you're worth?" "He's right, though, isn't he?" Lisa's voice cracked. "Look at me, serving drinks to people who make more in a day than I make in a year. Maybe I should just be realistic." "Girl, you listen to me." Her grandmother's voice took on the steel that had carried her through decades of others' expectations. "Your great-grandfather was a slave, and they told him he'd never be free. Your grandfather was a sharecropper, and they told him he'd never own land. I was a maid, and they told me I'd never send my daughter to college. But here you are, with a voice that could shake the heavens, talking about being realistic." The words hit Lisa like a physical force, straightening her spine. "I'm scared, Grandma." "Good. Fear means you're about to do something important. Your voice is a weapon, baby. It's time to use it." The conversation was interrupted by the pantry door opening. One of the other servers stood there, looking apologetic. "Lisa, that music producer guest is asking about you. Says he has a proposition." Lisa's grandmother had heard. "Sounds like your moment is coming, baby girl. Remember, you're not just singing for yourself. You're singing for all of us who were told to be quiet." After ending the call, Lisa emerged from the pantry to find Marcus waiting in the kitchen. His expression was both excited and concerned. "There's a lull in the party," he said without preamble. "The hired entertainment is taking a break. I mentioned to a few people that there might be a surprise performance." Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs. Through the kitchen doors, she could see Charles holding court, his dismissive words from earlier still ringing in her ears. The sheet music in her pocket seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. She retreated to the staff bathroom, gripping the edges of the sink as she stared at herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed different, older, perhaps, or simply more determined. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind, mixing with Charles's dismissive laughter and Marcus's offer of opportunity. The bathroom's harsh lighting highlighted every doubt on her face, every reason to stay quiet and invisible. But it also illuminated something else, a fire in her eyes that had been smoldering for years, waiting for the right moment to burst into flame. Her reflection watched as she slowly reached into her pocket and unfolded the sheet music, smoothing out the creases with trembling fingers. The notes she'd written stared back at her, black marks on white paper that contained everything she'd never been allowed to say. Someone knocked on the bathroom door. "Lisa, they're waiting. Are you going to do it?" She took one last look in the mirror, seeing not just herself but generations of silence waiting to be broken. Her answer, when it came, was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of thunder. "Yes." The journey from the bathroom to the main hall felt like walking through water. Each step required conscious effort, the weight of what Lisa was about to do making the familiar path seem foreign and treacherous. The sheet music in her hand had become damp with nervous sweat, but she gripped it like a shield. Conversations ebbed around her as she moved through the service corridor. For the first time that evening, she was grateful for her invisible uniform. It allowed her one final moment of anonymity before everything changed. The sounds of the party grew louder as she approached. Ice cubes clinking against crystal, sophisticated laughter, the subtle undercurrent of power and privilege that permeated every gathering in the Thompson mansion. Marcus waited at the entrance to the main hall, his presence both reassuring and terrifying. He'd cleared this impromptu performance with the event coordinator, but his expression suggested he wasn't entirely sure how it would be received. "Ready?" he asked quietly, studying her face. Lisa nodded, not trusting her voice. Through the doorway, she could see Charles Thompson in his element, holding court near the temporary stage. He was telling what appeared to be a particularly amusing story, his hands gesturing expansively as his audience laughed on cue. His burgundy silk tie matched the wine in his glass perfectly, a detail Lisa had never noticed before but now seemed absurdly important. The hired band was on break, their instruments temporarily abandoned on the stage. The baby grand piano sat unoccupied, its polished surface reflecting the chandelier light like a mirror. Lisa had cleaned that piano countless times, but had never touched its keys. Charles insisted that staff shouldn't handle the instruments except for maintenance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus's voice cut through the ambient noise, strong and confident. A few heads turned. "I hope you'll indulge me in a small interruption to the evening's scheduled entertainment." More heads turned now. Charles paused mid-sentence, his expression showing mild annoyance at having his story interrupted. His eyes found Marcus, then shifted to Lisa, standing slightly behind him. For a moment, confusion crossed his face, the look of someone trying to place a familiar object in an unfamiliar context. Lisa felt her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. The crowd's attention was like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She recognized faces from countless other parties, the venture capitalist who always demanded specific BR, Anns of sparkling water, the real estate mogul who never said thank you, the socialite who had once complained that Lisa's footsteps were too loud while serving. These people had spent years looking past her. Now they were all staring directly at her, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to obvious discomfort. A few were whispering behind their hands, no doubt wondering why a servant was being allowed to disrupt their evening. Charles's voice cut through the murmurs. "Marcus, while we appreciate your initiative, perhaps we should stick to the professional entertainment we've arranged." His tone was light, but carried an edge of warning. The same tone he used when staff members overstepped their bounds. "Trust me, Charles," Marcus replied, his smile never wavering. "What we're about to hear is as professional as it gets." He turned to Lisa, speaking quietly. "The stage is yours. Show them what they've been too blind to see." Lisa's feet carried her forward, each step feeling simultaneously like she was floating and wading through concrete. The distance to the stage was maybe 30 feet, but it might as well have been 30 miles. She was acutely aware of every detail. The subtle creak of the polished hardwood floor under her shoes, the rustle of her starched uniform, the weight of decades of silence pressing down on her shoulders. As she approached the piano, she heard the whispers intensify. Someone laughed, a short, sharp sound quickly hushed. Charles had moved closer to the stage, his expression now a mixture of disbelief and growing anger. She recognized that look. It was the same one he wore when staff members failed to follow his precise instructions about how things should be done in his house. The piano bench was cool beneath her as she sat down. Her uniform skirt rustled as she adjusted her position, the sound seeming unnaturally loud in the increasingly quiet room. She placed her sheet music on the stand with hands that only trembled slightly. The keys before her were pristine, untouched by her despite years of proximity. Charles stepped forward again, his voice carrying a barely contained fury. "Lisa, I don't know what you think you're doing," but the first chord cut him off mid-sentence, filling the room with a sound that seemed to stop time itself. The opening notes hung in the air like suspended crystals, each one pure and deliberate. Then Lisa began to sing, and the world shifted on its axis. Her voice emerged not as the timid sound they might have expected from a housekeeper, but as something raw and powerful. The song, her own composition, started softly, a story of early mornings cleaning other people's treasures, of dreams deferred but never abandoned. The lyrics painted pictures of her grandmother's hands, worn from decades of serving others, still strong enough to guide young fingers across piano keys. The initial shock in the room was palpable. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses stopped clinking. Even the servers frozen in place, trays half lifted. In the sudden silence, Lisa's voice filled every corner of the vast room, bouncing off marble floors and crystal chandeliers that had witnessed countless displays of wealth, but had never heard anything quite like this. Charles Thompson stood rooted to his spot, his face cycling through a series of expressions. Initial dismissal, then surprise, followed by something approaching disbelief. The wine glass in his hand tilted dangerously as his grip loosened, dark red liquid sloshing against crystal. As the first verse built into the chorus, Lisa's voice grew stronger, carrying years of suppressed truth. The song spoke of invisible people, the ones who served drinks, who cleaned homes, who were told to be grateful for whatever scraps fell from the tables of the wealthy. But it wasn't a song of self-pity. It was an anthem of defiance, of dignity maintained in the face of casual cruelty, of dreams protected like flames in a storm. The audience began to shift uncomfortably as the lyrics struck home. Some looked at their shoes, suddenly conscious of the servers standing against the walls. Others stared at Lisa with new eyes, as if seeing her for the first time. A woman in the front row, wearing jewelry worth more than Lisa's yearly salary, raised a manicured hand to wipe away an unexpected tear. Marcus stood at the back of the room, his experienced producer's ear recognizing something extraordinary. This wasn't just talent. It was lightning in a bottle, the kind of authentic voice that came along once in a generation. His fingers were already twitching toward his phone, making mental notes about arrangements and studios. The song's bridge spoke of a legacy of silence. Generations of people told to be quiet, to be grateful, to know their place. But as Lisa's voice soared into the higher registers, the message transformed into one of breaking free, of refusing to be defined by others' expectations. Her fingers danced across the keys, creating a melody that seemed to echo every unspoken word, every swallowed response, every forced smile. Charles had moved closer to the stage, his face now displaying something more complex than anger. Perhaps it was the way the light hit his eyes, but there appeared to be moisture gathering there. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he set his wine glass down on a nearby table. The final verse built to a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the mansion. Lisa's voice carried not just her own story, but the stories of everyone who had ever been told they weren't enough, weren't the right kind, weren't meant for greatness. The notes seemed to strip away the fancy decorations and expensive artworks, laying bare the human hearts beating beneath designer clothes and carefully maintained veneers. As the last note faded, Lisa's fingers stilled on the keys. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind of quiet that falls when something fundamental has shifted in the universe. For a moment, no one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, someone began to clap. The sound was joined by another, then another, building like a wave until it filled the space with the same intensity as Lisa's voice had moments before. People were standing now, their applause carrying an urgency that suggested they weren't just acknowledging a performance. They were participating in a moment of transformation. Through tears she hadn't realized she'd shed, Lisa looked out at the crowd. She saw Marcus beaming proudly, already reaching for his business card. She saw her fellow staff members standing straighter, some openly crying. And she saw Charles Thompson, the man who had dismissed her dreams hours earlier, staring at her with an expression that suggested his entire worldview had just been shattered. The applause continued, but Lisa barely heard it. She was listening to a different sound, the voice of her grandmother, somewhere in her memory, saying, "Let them underestimate you, baby. Then sing so loud they never forget who you are." The standing ovation continued for what felt like an eternity, its intensity carrying an undercurrent of collective guilt and awakening. Guests who had barely acknowledged Lisa's existence hours before were now clambering to get closer to the stage, their faces transformed by something more profound than mere appreciation of talent. As Lisa rose from the piano bench, her legs trembling slightly, the crowd surged forward. The invisible barrier between server and served had been shattered, swept away by the force of her performance. Women who had previously pressed jewelry-laden hands to their chests in disdain now reached out to grasp her hands, their expensive mascara streaking with genuine tears. "I had no idea," one socialite whispered, clutching Lisa's arm. "All these years, you've been here, and we never—" She trailed off, Ingley unable to complete the thought. Behind her, others pressed forward, each bearing similar expressions of revelation mixed with shame. Marcus worked his way through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone used to navigating social situations. He reached Lisa's side and smoothly inserted himself between her and the more aggressive well-wishers, providing a buffer of professional protection. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried the authority of his position in the music industry. Let's give Miss Carter some space. The crowd reluctantly yielded, but their eyes remained fixed on Lisa. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so dramatically it was almost visible. Servers along the walls stood straighter, their expressions a mixture of pride and vindication. Some of the younger staff members were crying openly, recognizing in Lisa's triumph their own suppressed hopes. Through the shifting crowd, Charles Thompson made his way toward the stage. The party guests parted before him out of habit, though their deference seemed more mechanical than genuine now. His normally commanding presence appeared diminished, as if Lisa's voice had stripped away layers of his carefully constructed authority. He stopped a few feet from Lisa, and for the first time in her years of employment, he seemed uncertain how to address her. The man who had confidently proclaimed the natural order of things just hours before now stood before her like a supplicant, his earlier condescension replaced by something approaching awe. "Lisa," he began, then stopped, seemingly searching for words that wouldn't sound hollow. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, he spoke again, his voice carrying an unfamiliar note of humility. "I owe you an apology. What you just did, what you've always been capable of, I was wrong, spectacularly wrong." The room held its breath, watching this unexpected reversal of roles. Charles continued, each word seemingly dragged from a deep well of realization. "I would like to help you. Whatever you need, connections, opportunities, resources, they're yours. I want to make this right." Lisa stood still, absorbing his words. The temptation to accept, to grasp this offered hand of privilege was strong, but something in her hesitated. She studied Charles's face, noting the sincerity there, but also recognizing something else. A desire to ease his own conscience, to quickly transform himself from villain to savior in this story. Her response, when it came, was measured and clear, carrying the same quiet power as her song. "Mr. Thompson, I appreciate your offer, but I think we both need time to process what happened here tonight. Real change, real understanding, doesn't happen in a moment, even one as powerful as this." The crowd murmured, some nodding in approval at her wisdom, others shifting uncomfortably at her refusal to provide immediate absolution. Charles blinked, unused to having his generous gestures met with anything but grateful acceptance. He opened his mouth as if to protest, then closed it again, seeming to realize that his usual methods of controlling situations no longer applied. Marcus, still standing protectively near Lisa, watched this exchange with keen interest. His producer's instincts told him that this moment, this tension between redemption offered and redemption earned, was as significant as the performance itself. The story unfolding here was bigger than just talent discovered. It was about dignity reclaimed and power redistributed. As the crowd continued to watch, their expensive clothes and jewelry seeming somehow less impressive than they had at the start of the evening, Lisa stood at the center of it all, transformed but not overwhelmed. She had stepped out of the shadows, but she would do so on her own terms, at her own pace. The night air through the mansion's open windows carried the promise of change, but also the weight of uncertainty. Nothing would be quite the same after this evening. Not for Lisa, not for Charles, and not for anyone who had witnessed this transformation. The question hanging in the air was, what kind of change would it be? The energy in the mansion had transformed completely from the polite society gathering it had been hours before. Small groups had formed throughout the ballroom, their conversations intense and focused, all centered around what they had just witnessed. Lisa found herself at the heart of a storm she had created, watching as her single act of courage rippled outward in unexpected ways. Marcus orchestrated a quiet moment in Charles's private study, away from the continuing commotion of the main party. The wood-paneled room, with its leather-bound books and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors, had always been off-limits to staff. Now Lisa sat in one of the expensive armchairs, her uniform stark against the rich fabric, while Charles stood near his desk, still visibly processing the evening's events. "Your talent is undeniable," Charles began, his voice carrying a new note of caution. "I'm prepared to sponsor your first professional recording session. My connections in the industry—" "Mr. Thompson," Lisa interrupted gently but firmly, "I appreciate what you're trying to do. But this isn't just about me getting a recording contract." She smoothed her uniform skirt, a habit born of nervousness, but executed with newfound confidence. "This is about something bigger." Marcus leaned forward in his chair, his producer's instincts recognizing a crucial moment. "She's right, Charles. What happened out there wasn't just a performance. It was a wake-up call." Charles paced behind his desk, his usual commanding presence somewhat diminished. "Then tell me what you want, Lisa. Name it. I'm trying to make this right." "What I want," Lisa said carefully, "is for you to understand that true change isn't about grand gestures or quick fixes. It's about recognizing patterns that have gone unchallenged for too long." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Yes, I'll accept your offer to perform at other events, but not as a token of your redemption. As a professional, with the respect that entails." Through the study's heavy doors, they could hear the continuing buzz of conversation from the party. The other servers were still working, but there was a different energy to their movements now, a subtle straightening of spines, a quiet assertion of dignity that hadn't been there before. Charles moved to the window, looking out over his manicured grounds. "You understand this will complicate things. Some of my associates, they have certain expectations about how things should be." "Yes," Lisa agreed, "they do. And maybe it's time those expectations were challenged." She stood, her reflection ghosting across the window glass. "Your influence could do more than just help one singer, Mr. Thompson. It could help change the conversation entirely." Marcus watched this exchange with growing respect. The Lisa who had hesitated in the kitchen seemed like a different person now. This woman spoke with the quiet authority of someone who knew exactly what she was worth. "There will be resistance," Charles warned, turning back to face them. "Not everyone will welcome this kind of change." "There always is," Lisa responded. "But staying silent isn't an option anymore." She reached in her pocket, touching the folded sheet music that had started it all. "My grandmother used to say that real change isn't about making noise. It's about making the right kind of noise, the kind that forces people to listen." As if to emphasize her point, a burst of conversation leaked through from the main room. They could hear animated discussions about talent and opportunity, about assumptions and oversight. The party had transformed into something resembling a town hall, with guests openly questioning their own roles in maintaining the barriers Lisa's performance had exposed. Charles moved to his desk, his movements less certain than usual. He picked up a pen, started to write something, then put it down again. "You're not going to make this easy, are you?" "No, sir," Lisa replied, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "But then again, nothing worth doing ever is." The study fell into thoughtful silence. Through the window, the first hints of dawn were appearing, promising a new day that would be unlike any before it. The old order had been shaken, not by violence or protest, but by the simple act of someone refusing to remain invisible. But in the quiet of that moment, as three very different people contemplated very different futures, there was also a sense of unfinished business. The real work, the difficult day-to-day work of creating lasting change, was just beginning. In the days following the party, Lisa's phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Videos of her performance, secretly recorded by party guests, had begun circulating through private social media channels. Messages of support flooded in from unexpected sources. Other household staff members across the wealthy enclave, sharing their own stories of buried dreams and silent struggles. The morning after her performance, Lisa sat at her small kitchen table, her grandmother's weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee across from her. The morning light filtered through thin curtains, casting patterns on the walls that seemed to dance with possibility. "They're talking about you all over town, baby," her grandmother said, her voice carrying both pride and concern. "The other maids at the country club, they're saying you've started something." She paused, studying her granddaughter's face. "You ready for what comes next?" Lisa scrolled through another message on her phone. This one from a former Thompson household employee, sharing her own story of discouraged ambitions. "I don't think anyone's ever really ready for something like this, Grandma. But staying quiet isn't an option anymore." Across town, in his mahogany-paneled office, Charles Thompson was facing his own storm. His phone had been ringing since dawn, calls from fellow business leaders and social peers demanding explanations. The latest call was from Gerald Whitman, his longtime friend and president of the country club's board of directors. "Have you lost your mind, Charles?" Gerald's voice crackled through the speakerphone. "First you let the help perform at your party, and now I hear you're talking about sponsoring her? Do you have any idea what kind of precedent this sets?" Charles rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of decades of unquestioned traditions pressing down on him. "You weren't there, Gerald. You didn't hear her sing. This isn't about setting precedents. It's about recognizing talent that we've been blind to." "Talent?" Gerald scoffed. "Since when did that matter more than maintaining proper order? Next thing you know, all our staff will think they deserve special treatment. It's already starting. My housekeeper asked about taking evening classes yesterday." "Evening classes? Who does she think will serve dinner?" The conversation ended with Gerald threatening to revoke Charles's club membership, a threat that would have terrified him just days ago. Now, staring at the phone, he felt something unfamiliar, doubt about the very systems he'd spent his life defending. But not everyone in Charles's circle reacted with hostility. His daughter Rebecca, home from her first year at law school, sat in his office later that day, her expression thoughtful as she watched her father struggle with his competing impulses. "You know, Dad," she said carefully, "what happened at the party, it's exactly what we've been discussing in my social justice seminar. About how systems perpetuate themselves until someone forces them to change." She leaned forward, her young face earnest. "You have a chance to be part of that change." Charles looked at his daughter, seeing for the first time how much she'd grown beyond the privilege bubble he'd created for her. "It's not that simple, Rebecca. There are relationships, expectations, decades of how things are done. Maybe that's exactly why it needs to change," she replied softly. Meanwhile, at her tiny apartment, Lisa was preparing for her next shift at the Thompson mansion. Her phone pinged with another message from Marcus, discussing potential studio time, but something else had caught her attention. A news notification about a local community center facing closure, one that had provided music education to underprivileged children for decades. She thought about Charles's offer of help, about the power of visibility, about the responsibility that came with breaking silence. Perhaps there was a way to make this about more than just her own dreams. The notifications kept coming. Messages of support, offers of help, but also warnings and veiled threats from those who preferred the old order. Some of Charles's friends had already canceled their contracts with staff members who had shown too much enthusiasm for Lisa's performance. Each message, each reaction, rippled outward, creating waves in a pond that had been still for too long. The simple act of one woman refusing to remain invisible had sparked conversations in servants' quarters and boardrooms alike, forcing people to confront uncomfortable truths about the worlds they had built and maintained. As Lisa prepared for work, straightening her uniform one last time, her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "Change ain't never polite, baby. It comes in and rearranges all the furniture, whether folks are ready or not." The sun was rising on a new day, but the shadows of the old order still lingered, promising that the real challenges were only beginning. The question wasn't just whether Lisa would succeed in her own dreams, but whether the cracks she had created in the system would spread wide enough to let in more light. Several months had passed since the night of Lisa's impromptu performance. The Thompson Mansion's grand ballroom was being prepared for what the society papers were calling the event of the season, a charity gala where Lisa would be the headline performer. But beneath the surface of this seemingly perfect narrative of redemption and opportunity, complications were brewing. Charles had thrown himself into the role of champion for diversity with the same intensity he brought to his business dealings. Press releases from his office highlighted new initiatives, scholarship programs for service workers' children, funding for arts education in underprivileged communities, mandatory sensitivity training for his corporate staff. His social media accounts, previously focused on business achievements, now overflowed with posts about inclusion and opportunity. It's all happening so fast, Lisa confided to her grandmother during their weekly Sunday dinner. The small apartment kitchen felt like the only place where she could still think clearly. Sometimes I wonder if he's really changed, or if he's just found a new way to be in control. Her grandmother, still sharp at 75, stirred her tea thoughtfully. Men like Charles Thompson don't change overnight, baby. They just learn to adapt. Question is, are they adapting because they understand, or because they want to look like they understand? The upcoming gala had been Charles's idea, a showcase event featuring Lisa, with promises that the guest list would include people from all walks of life. But as the planning progressed, familiar patterns emerged. The ticket prices, while lower than usual for such events, were still beyond the reach of most working-class families. The dress code remained formal, creating another barrier for those without access to designer wardrobes. Marcus, who had been working with Lisa on her first album, noticed the contradictions. During a recording session break, he voiced his concerns. He's marketing this as a celebration of breaking down barriers, he said, reviewing the event materials, but look at the fine print. VIP sections, premium access areas. He's just creating new hierarchies while pretending to demolish the old ones. Lisa's phone buzzed with another message from Charles's PR team, requesting her presence at yet another photo opportunity. The caption would read, "From kitchen to stage, a story of transformation." The irony wasn't lost on her. They were selling inspiration while carefully controlling the narrative. Rumors began circulating through both the wealthy enclaves and the service communities. Some suggested that Charles had orchestrated the whole thing from the beginning, turning Lisa's moment of defiance into a carefully managed PR campaign. Others whispered that he was using her story to deflect attention from other controversies in his business practices. One evening, as Lisa rehearsed in the mansion's music room, no longer relegated to practicing in secret, she overheard a conversation between Charles and one of his board members. "Brilliant move, Charles," the man said, his voice carrying through the partially open door. "Who would dare criticize your labor practices now that you're the champion of the downtrodden? The publicity value alone." Lisa's fingers stilled on the piano keys. The sheet music before her, new songs about authenticity and truth, seemed to mock her. Had she traded one form of invisibility for another, more insidious kind? The gala's date approached with increasing momentum. Local media ran feature stories about Charles Thompson's journey of awareness, complete with carefully staged photos of him mentoring young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds. Fashion magazines praised his brave stance against social inequality, while business publications applauded his innovative approach to corporate social responsibility. But in the service entrances and back hallways of wealthy homes across the city, different conversations were happening. The very people this transformation was supposed to benefit watched with increasing skepticism as their stories were packaged and marketed by the same system that had silenced them for so long. A week before the gala, Lisa received an unmarked envelope. Inside was a collection of documents, internal memos, emails, and financial records suggesting that Charles's sudden embrace of social justice coincided suspiciously with mounting pressure from labor rights organizations and pending investigations into his business practices. The final document was a draft press release, dated before her performance at the party, outlining a strategy to get ahead of potential controversy by identifying and promoting suitable success stories from within the service staff. Lisa stood in her apartment, the papers scattered across her small dining table, feeling the weight of a decision approaching. The gala would put her in front of influential people who could launch her career. But at what cost? Had her act of defiance been truly transformative, or had it simply been absorbed and repurposed by the very system she'd hoped to challenge? Her phone lit up with another message from Charles. "Everything is set for next week. This will be a night no one forgets." The words seemed to glow with unintended irony in the growing darkness of her apartment. Indeed, it would be a night no one would forget, but perhaps not for the reasons Charles Thompson imagined. The night of the gala arrived with all the grandeur Charles Thompson's wealth could provide. The Thompson mansion blazed with light, its windows gleaming like jewels against the darkening sky. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, but this time they mixed with more modest vehicles, a calculated display of inclusivity that had been heavily promoted in the press. Lisa stood in what had once been her changing room, now converted into an artist's dressing room. The irony of preparing for her performance in the same space where she had once donned her servant's uniform wasn't lost on her. The documents she'd received lay hidden in her bag, their revelations weighing heavily on her conscience. Her new song, written in the sleepless nights following the discovery of Charles's true motives, sat on the dressing table. Its lyrics spoke of masks and mirrors, of truth and transformation, but not in the inspirational way the PR team had approved. They didn't know she had changed the program at the last minute. The ballroom hummed with anticipation. Charles worked the crowd masterfully, playing the role of enlightened philanthropist with practiced ease. This night, he announced to a cluster of reporters, represents everything we're trying to achieve: breaking down barriers, creating opportunities, building bridges between communities. The audience was indeed more diverse than usual for such an event, though the divisions remained visible in subtle ways. The slight segregation in seating arrangements, the different quality of champagne served at different tables, the way security guards watched some guests more closely than others. Marcus stood near the stage, his producer's instincts telling him something was about to happen. He had seen the shift in Lisa's eyes during their last rehearsal, recognized the quiet determination that reminded him of that first night months ago. When Lisa finally took the stage, the room fell silent. She looked different now. Gone were both the servant's uniform and the designer clothes Charles's team had selected. Instead, she wore a simple dress that could have belonged to either world, refusing to be categorized. The opening notes seemed familiar enough, and Charles smiled with satisfaction from his prominent seat. But as Lisa began to sing, his smile froze. These weren't the approved lyrics. This wasn't the carefully crafted narrative of redemption and gratitude they had planned. Instead, Lisa's voice carried a different story, one of superficial change and repackaged oppression, of old power wearing new masks. She sang about documents in unmarked envelopes, about PR strategies planned before moments of spontaneous inspiration, about the way privilege always finds new ways to maintain itself. The reaction in the room shifted like a wave. Some guests squirmed uncomfortably, recognizing their own complicity. Others sat straighter, finally hearing their own experiences acknowledged. Charles half rose from his seat, but the cameras were rolling, live streaming to social media as his team had insisted. He couldn't stop what was happening without confirming everything Lisa's song suggested. Then came the moment that sealed the evening's place in history. A member of the catering staff stepped forward, holding up a phone displaying one of Charles's internal memos. Another worker did the same, then another. They had all received copies of the documents, their truth impossible to ignore. Ladies and gentlemen, Lisa's voice cut through the growing murmur. Real change isn't about rebranding inequality. It's about dismantling it. She turned directly to Charles. You taught me that lesson, Mr. Thompson, though not in the way you intended. The silence that followed was deafening. Charles stood, his face flushed, but before he could speak, others rose too. Not just servers and staff, but guests. Those who had seen through the facade, who recognized that true transformation couldn't be managed by PR teams. Perhaps, Lisa continued, her voice strong and clear, it's time for a different kind of conversation. One where we don't just perform change, but actually create it. The evening exploded into chaos, but productive chaos, the kind that breaks old patterns and forces new beginnings. Reporters rushed to capture the moment. Social media exploded with real-time updates. And in the midst of it all, Lisa remained at the microphone, finally telling the whole truth. As the night drew to a close, Lisa found herself back in the kitchen where it had all started. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. Sometimes you have to break something completely before you can build it back right. She touched the worn surface of the kitchen counter, remembering all the dreams that had been born and buried in spaces like this. But this time, the silence was broken not just by one voice, but by many, and they were getting louder. The story made headlines the next day, but not the ones Charles had planned. Instead of a tale of benevolent transformation, it became a catalyst for genuine dialogue about power, privilege, and the difference between performing change and creating it. Lisa's career would indeed launch from that night, not as a carefully managed symbol of corporate enlightenment, but as a voice for authentic transformation. And in mansions and servants' quarters across the city, people began to ask different questions, have different conversations, demand different answers. The natural order, as Charles had once called it, hadn't just been challenged. It had been changed, not by grand gestures or PR campaigns, but by the simple, uncompromising power of truth.